So I am the author of 3 novels, actually 4, 4 now. My latest just came out. It's The Bridge Home, and I'm very excited about it. I'm holding up the audiobook because I actually did the audiobook version myself as well. And that was a first for me, and very exciting. So The Bridge Home is my 4th novel, and just very succinctly, it's about 2 children, 2 girls who run away from home because of abuse and find themselves homeless on the streets of an Indian city, where they find 2 boys that are orphans and living on the streets as well. And together with a dog that they adopt, they form a little family. And it's about everything that they go through together, their adventures, if you will, in that terrible situation, and their ability to laugh as well, even though they have such a terrible situation. So The Bridge Home is a novel that's sort of the newest baby, the one I'm most excited about. And my previous novels are Climbing the Stairs, my first novel, which actually was edited by John Rudolph, who is now an agent who's going to be on your show. So there's a connection. And my second novel, Island's End. So my first novel, Climbing the Stairs, takes place in India in the 1940s. It was one of the first historical fiction novels for young adults to be written and published in this country. Not the first, but one of the first. And Island's End is about a tribe that lived close to me when I was on the Andaman Islands of India as an oceanographer. So I ended up coming to writing after doing a PhD, a doctorate in oceanography, and working as an oceanographer for a while. And Island's End is about leadership. It's about culture clashes between indigenous people and the modern world, and about rainforests and coral reefs and all these other things that are now threatened by our modern civilization. And A Time to Dance, which is my third novel, is the first young adult novel that deals with spirituality or spiritual awakening as a main theme, as seen through the Hindu lens. So the lens of a young Hindu girl.
Well, Padma, you've got such an amazing background. I want to talk a lot about The Bridge Home today because I am truly over the moon in love with this book. I try never to say I love one book other than others because I talk to a lot of authors, and that's a way to lose friends. But I love your book more than some others. It's rapidly become one of my absolute favorites. We're going to talk about that. I've been joking with my wife over the weekend and the last week here, knowing I was going to get to talk with you, that how am I possibly going to talk with someone as accomplished as Padma is. And usually if I have a guest on the show, I assume they're probably smarter than I am, and anybody who listens or watches the show would probably agree with that sentiment. But in this case, there's no ambiguity whatsoever. I know you're smarter than me. Well, let's start with the fact that you've lived in 5 different countries. What has living in 5 different countries taught you about the world, and what has it brought to your writing?
I think I could talk about that for just a day in itself. First of all, though, I do want to say there are so many different kinds of intelligence and so many different kinds of smartness, and I'm sure that I'm not smarter than you in all of those ways, certainly not. And I think that's such an important thing, really, to recognize. I mean, sometimes we think of intelligence or smartness in only one way, and there is such a lot of ways that we don't recognize as well. Anyways, living
I will quickly acknowledge that if you and I were to play Mortal Kombat, I might win.
Exactly, you certainly would. So I grew up in India. So I was born in India, and I grew up, and I was there for most of my childhood and most of my teen years. So I was there for about 19 years. And then I ended up going to England on a scholarship and studying at an international school there. And that was, it was called Brockwood Park. It was actually a lot like, Hogwarts. It really was. It had a tower. We would go up there and look at the stars and all of this. Anyway, it was a wonderful year for me, and a year during which I did a lot of writing. And it meant a lot to me, actually, that year, that people who were British, the people who had, or who knew English and no other language, to whom English was a first language, actually thought that I spoke it and I wrote it as if it were my mother tongue as well. So that was something that really was very helpful to me. Felt very supported by that. And after that, I came to the States, and I've lived here for longer than I want to let you know, because then you'll know my exact age. Not that I really care, but maybe
I'm
that's
guessing around 25. Am I pretty close?
Yeah, just about 5 years ago. Anyways, so I came here, and I went to graduate school at the College of William and Mary, and I studied oceanography. And it was quite an unusual decision for, I think, a woman of color, but also in India, we have, there were lots of social stigmas attached to things, and oceanography was not usually on the radar for anyone. But I did it anyway, and I'm very glad that I did. And after I did oceanography, and during the course of many other things, I finished my doctorate. I did my postdoc at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. But in between, I worked in Germany for a while, and I worked in the United Arab Emirates as well for a while. So I've lived actually in those 5 countries beyond other countries that I've visited. And I think the one thing that I've learned is that we say a lot about equality. We mouth these words, but then I think the experience of actually living in those countries is what brought it home to me, in my head and also in my heart. The idea that no matter what religion you subscribe to, no matter what ethnicity you might have, what race you might have, what gender you might have, and where you might be on the disability spectrum, it doesn't matter. There are things that we all share, and there's also things that we will never share. And I think both need to be respected, in that each of us is very, very different as well from everyone else. Does that make sense?
It does, and I've got so many questions for you. I want to go back for just one quick second, because I know you've talked about your upbringing before without dragging the whole thing out. I know that you were in a situation somewhat similar to the children in the Bridge home, and that you were in an abusive household, and then you were raised by a single mother, and you were not necessarily in dire poverty yourself, but certainly surrounded by quite a bit of poverty. How did you get from there to winning a scholarship to ascend to where you're at today on the Middle Grade Ninja Show?
I think a lot of things changed. So when I was born into a family that was extremely wealthy, but my mother was fiercely independent, as was I. So when my father and my mother split up, which was extremely unusual in India, I was the only child with parents who were separated that I knew growing up. And that's not to say it never happens, but I was the only one at my school, for instance, and so on. After he left, we had a huge fall. My mother started with less than zero in the bank, because there was a huge burden of debt as well. So that means that it was very, very, very difficult for several years. So throughout my childhood after that, so 8 on up until through when I left India and went away, and for many other years, it was very, very tough for my mother. It's only recently, I think, that she feels a little more comfortable. And of course, once I left, and I was, ultimately on my own dime, and it was a little difficult being a graduate student, but people would complain all the time about how poor they were as graduate students. And yes, it was difficult. Those were the days that we couldn't do what we're doing now, which is so remarkable to me. Technology was not that advanced. So I would have to call my mother on the phone, and you'd have these operators that said 3 minutes, and then they would cut you off after 3 minutes. And that was the one phone call I had every month to connect with my mother, who was overseas. And where I lived in Southern Virginia, there was no one else that I knew who were, no friends or family nearby, except for the friends that I made at the school. And so that's something that I think many authors, even who are second generation or who have come here with their parents at a young age to this country, don't completely understand what that feels like and how very independent you need to be able to do something like that. And I don't even think I thought twice about it until now. And recently, somebody was talking about something, and I imagined my own child at 19 leaving and going halfway across the world. That's when I realized what I did. And I think it can be quite scary. And certainly for me, it was different. It was interesting. I learned a lot. I learned certainly to be independent, to be on my own 2 feet. And well, now I think I'm fine financially, luckily. I'm not necessarily rolling in wealth, but I certainly have a degree that I can fall back on. And I think the thing that I learned the most from my mother was this. She had a lot of education. And that was why when my father left home and left her in this financial mess, and me as well, he did not pay toward my upkeep or any of that. And when that happened, I think the reason that she was able to take off is not quite the word perhaps, but to make ends meet really, was because she had, an education, and she always talked about that. The importance of that education that nobody could take away from her, and how she could fall back on that and use that to start from scratch, or less than scratch, I should say.